Good afternoon.
Hi, Dr. Rose.
How are you?
Okay, how are you?
Busy, busy, crazy,
Me too. Me too.
insanely busy.
Oh,
There,
that's good, right?
all is well. I mean, it's moving in a very positive and beautiful direction. Good afternoon, Dr. Morris. How are you?
Doing well. How are you, Dr. Rose? Hello, Dr. Pam.
I am expecting Elder Renee to join us, and the session is being recorded. So if she does jump on, we'll just allow her to join the conversation. Please allow me to share our reason for being on this call. We've been running our Junior Order of Melchizedek program, and we wanted to conclude with a big celebration at the African American Museum of Beginnings, but making arrangements to do that was difficult. So we knew that we had living history as a part of our organization. And so what we'd like to do is just do a short interview with Dr. Ken Morris. Kenneth Morris is the great grandson is the great grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great grandson of Booker T. Washington. He also serves, among other things, as the president of the board of directors of the Ecumenical Center for Black Church Studies. That's ECBCS. That's our organization that actually sponsors the Junior Order of Melchizedek. And I see Elder Renee has joined the line. And so
Yeah.
I'm going to ask that Elder Renee and Dr. Pam introduce themselves first. Then I have a first question for Dr. Morris. So, Elder Renee, you want to say hello to those young people who are watching our show this afternoon?
Well, good morning. Well, good morning, good afternoon to young people who are watching this show. We want to bid you adieu. Introducing myself, I am Elder Renee. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Laverne Black Church Studies, where it has been one of the best experiences one can have when journeying through life.
Thank you. Elder Pam, I'm sorry, Dr. Pam, you want to say a word real quickly, and then we'll hear from Dr. Morris.
Yes, I am a student in the Ecumenical Center for Black Church Studies program at University of Laverne. I say that with great pride. I was introduced to this program by Dr. Rose, participating as a member of his church. And you never know what you're going to do. I'm a practicing physician. I, in fact, retired 15 years ago. And you go to school for 15 years, you don't want to waste it. So I am out in the community serving. But my goal is to learn more, be more, grow more before it's too late to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pam. We're going to go ahead and begin a round of questioning for Dr. Morris. So, Renee, please don't leave. You will have the questions following me, and then we'll hear from Dr. Pam. Depending on our time, we may be able to do a second round. But Dr. Morris, again, I introduced you. I introduced your legacy. How were you introduced to your heritage? In other words, how did you come to know you had ancestors that were so important to the history of our nation and ultimately the history of our world?
A wonderful question. But before I jump into that, I just want to say that it's my honor to be with you this afternoon, to have an opportunity to talk about this history and this blood that flows through my veins. And, as you introduced me, it's always difficult to count all of those greats. And so, that happens all the time. But, as I always tell students, I always tell young people, every time I introduce myself and I say I'm the great grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great grandson of Booker T. Washington, that's a whole lot of greats. I understand it. But not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And the young people listening to this conversation might have a hard time trying to imagine my connection to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know a grandparent, and some of you listening and watching may even know a great grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglas, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 101 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 94, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting at the knee of my great-grandmother Fanny and my Aunt Portia, and they would tell me firsthand stories about Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. And one day it hit me when I was trying to make the connection between the distance of the generations, that hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man. I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country when you consider the generations. And so I just wanted to start there just to kind of set the table and the foundation, because the other way you introduced me is living history. And yes, I'm getting very old, but I don't know that I'm necessarily historic. So to your question, there was never a time when someone sat me down and said, hey, we've got really something important to tell you about your ancestry. I've always known. I spent all of my summers at Frederick Douglass's summer beach house on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay in a place called Highland Beach, Maryland, which was built by my great-great-grandfather Charles, who was Frederick and Anna's youngest son. Charles built the home for his father to retire in, and he asked his dad, are there any special features that you want in the house? And Frederick said, yes, I wanted to sit right on the water. I wanted to point in a certain direction, and I want you to build a tower at the top, because what he wanted to do at the end of his life was to sit in that tower, look back across the water, back across the Chesapeake Bay, because on the other side you can see land, and that land is the eastern shore of Maryland, where he had been born into slavery with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And so there were images of my ancestors in every room of that house. And I would say I was probably about 5 or 6 years old when I started to notice that they were on statues, and they were on money and postage stamps, and schools were named for them, bridges were named for them, libraries, and where I turned, I could kind of feel like I was sitting in this long, vast shadow of two very important figures in history. And I would ask my classmates and my friends, are your grandparents on statues? And of course, they would answer no. So again, there was never a time when someone just sat me down. I just always knew.
I'm muted. Thank you so very much for that response. Elder Renee, you have a question for Dr. Morrison, and then Dr. Pam, you can follow Elder Renee.
Wow, that just the whole story, it was amazing. So my question to you is if the children now look up and see your, what that statue convey? If we looked at
another fantastic question. Frederick Douglass had a great quote. He said, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I will add to that, and women. So at our organization, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, as a part of our mission statement, is to build strong children. And we spend a lot of time in K through 12 schools talking about the legacies of my ancestors and teaching about this history. And one of the things that I learned from my studies at the University of Laverne, and I learned many things. I also am a part of the Ecumenical Center for Black Church Studies, and I'm very proud of that. I went back to college later in life. I got my degree in 2018. And I learned when we studied all of these great historic figures and religious figures that I don't think were necessarily thinking about what their legacies would be, or thinking about that they would one day be on statues and be on money. The work that was in front of them needed to be done. And I just believe that they started the work, they built consensus around that work, they got support around that work, and they just forged ahead. Now, I won't doubt that Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and many others didn't think about what their legacies would be long term, because it was really important to all of these figures, these Black leaders, that they shape their own narratives and tell their own stories. And that's a great message and lesson for us today, for young people today, is to make sure that you tell your story, present yourself in the world the way that you want to be seen. And so Frederick Douglass certainly did that with writing 3 best-selling autobiographies. He wrote tens of thousands of articles and letters that were published in his newspaper, the North Star, which was a leading abolitionist voice in the 19th century. It was a mouthpiece for his brethren, his people that were still enslaved. So I try to just continue to do the work and not really think about, what that legacy is going to look like. But what I do think about is what will my great-great-great-grandchildren, what will all of our great-great-grandchildren, for those of us that choose to have kids, what will we think about their ancestors in this moment in time in which we're living today, with the divisiveness that's in this country, with the xenophobic, racist, sexist rhetoric that's out there, the policies that are against women making their own choice, and what happened in Arizona yesterday with these draconian laws that date back to 1864 during the Civil War. So those are the types of things that I think about. I want my great-great-grandchildren to look back at me and to say, they're proud because he was on the right side of history, not on the wrong side of history. And trust me, I've met many descendants whose ancestors are on the right side of history. I've also met many descendants whose ancestors were on the wrong side of history, and they're not very proud of their ancestors, and they try to do right and walk in their own shoes. So those are the things that I think about.
Wow. I wish I could jump in with my follow-up, but it's Dr. Pam's turn. So Dr. Pam, go right ahead.
No, in
Turned
that
up.
same vein, I was just thinking, given the historical significance of your bloodline, and in fact, all of our bloodlines, it is no mistake that any of us and all of us have reached these heights that we have. But I'm concerned because the progress was slow, and it is, in fact, I believe, at this time in our lives, trying to be reversed. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather understood and had the ear of the president, Lincoln, at the time, that helped shape and motivate, even though there was so much happening to keep the ideas, the design, the obvious potential for progress was squashed even in his lifetime and in every generation since. So I now have children in their 40s, 50s. That means I have grandchildren. So my question to you, what could I do or say to any group of young people, starting at any age, to get them involved, motivated, and understand the need for them to take the torch that you are now carrying and continue to move that forward? Every Black mama wants to know, what do I do? What do I say? Where do I go to keep this going? Because the opposing forces are really trying to drag us down. You've mentioned xenophobia and racism, sexism, all the isms. What can I say to a 9-year-old? What can I say to a 13-year-old? What can I say to an 18-year-old to make them know that their involvement rests on the backs and the blood of our ancestors?
I feel your passion in those questions, and the first thing that I think about, and you talk about what do I say to a 9-year-old, what do I say to a 13-year-old? I'm going to tell you what a 10-year-old said to me when we first started doing this work. My mom and I, Nettie Washington Douglas, who, by the way, is the person that united the bloodlines of the Douglas and Washington families through the marriage of her mother, who was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter, and her father, Frederick Douglass III, was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. So my mom united the bloodlines, and we started our organization, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, in 2007. And I remember being in a classroom with fifth graders. And this young lady, young girl raised her hand and she was so excited. She was bouncing up and down in her chair and she's trying to get my attention. And finally, when I finished saying what I was saying, I called on her and she said, "Mr. Morris, I want you to know that my great, 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 great four greats grandmother was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write in secret, and then she ran away. She became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist, and she knew what that word meant. And she was really proud to know that her four times great grandmother was giving money to causes that she cared about, educational causes, and uplifting her community. And so she's just so excited to share this with me. And so she said, "So do you know what all of this means?" And before I had a chance to respond, she said, "It means I have greatness flowing through my veins just like you do." And I will never forget that, because we all have greatness flowing through our veins. The fact that we are here today is because of our ancestors that survived and overcame and persevered and never gave up. And we stand on the shoulders and we walk in the shoes of those that came before us. And while we all don't descend from somebody that has the notoriety that my ancestors have, I can guarantee that every single young person that's listening to this conversation, if they were to go back and ask their grandmother, the great grandmother, and just try to learn something about their own family tree, that they will find great heroes and great heroines in their own family story. People that may have given of their lives just for the freedoms that we do have today, may have given of their lives just so that we have the right to sit in a classroom at the University of Laverne and get an education. And so when young people can connect and understand that history is important for a lot of reasons, but I like to think history is most important because we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're headed. And if we don't know where we come from, if we don't know the sacrifices and struggles that came before us, then we're not going to be invested in wanting to make sure that, again, that our great, great, great grandchildren or the world that we leave behind, that we've helped to advance the movement in some way. I go back to what I talked about Frederick Douglass sitting in retirement in that beach house. And unfortunately, he passed away before it was completed. So he never got a chance to live in there and to sit in that tower. But even though he had spent 20 years enslaved, and when people would ask him, they'd see this white-haired statesman who was the first African-American nominated for vice president of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American ambassador and recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor in 1899 in Rochester, New York. And they would ask him, "Mr. Douglass, I need to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education?" And having never spent one day of his life in a classroom, because as we know, from our U.S. history, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. He was a self-taught scholar. He would respond on occasion by saying, "My diploma is written on my back. My diploma is written on my back." So here is a man who at the end of his life had suffered the brutality and inhumanity and the exploitation of slavery for 20 years before he escaped. And he wanted to sit in that tower and look back across the water and never forget where he came from. And so he understood the importance of knowing where you come from in order to know where you're headed. So for our young people, we spend a lot of time, and this is what I always advise, parents and teachers and mentors and pastors and those people that come into contact with our young people. We have to help them understand that greatness flows through their veins, that they have the blood of heroes and heroines flowing through their veins, just like I do, just like that 10-year-old young lady that I told you about in that story. And once we can get them, you'll see them. I've seen it for the past 17 years that we've been doing this work. You'll see them start to sit up straighter. You'll see them start to walk with their head higher. And what I found, my experience is, young people come back to me and they ask questions like, how can I be an abolitionist like a Frederick Douglass, a Sojourner Truth, a Harriet Tubman? How can I be a civil rights leader like a Rosa Parks, a Martin Luther King, a Cesar Chavez, a Dolores Huerta? How can I do that? And they get very creative and just inspiring them to know that within themselves, they can use their passion, their talent, their creativity, and their mind, their intellect to address those questions and those situations and those challenges that they face in their own lives. And history needs to be our guide. When Frederick Douglass was enslaved at 9 years old, his slave mistress began to teach him his ABCs. And he knew that that was going to be his pathway to freedom, because he heard his enslaver, Hugh Auld, when he found out about the lessons, he got angry. And he looked at young Frederick Bailey and he looked at his wife and he said, you cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. And I hope every young person listening to that heard that message. It will unfit him to be a slave if he gets educated. That's a message that is as relevant today as it was all of those years ago, because Frederick looked at his enslaver and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that education equals emancipation, education equals liberation, education equals freedom. And he would teach himself to read and write. And I'll just close really quickly because I'm going on about this because I'm passionate. But when Frederick Douglass would start to teach himself to read and write, he started to think critically about his condition of enslavement. Now, when you're born into slavery and you don't know what freedom looks and tastes like, you're never going to question that. But as he's starting to educate himself, he's starting to ask questions like, why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday and I don't know my birthday? And he would turn to God and he would pray to God for deliverance from his chains and his bondage. And he would say, God, I don't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday and goes to church, and in the word and Bible and cherry-picked scriptures finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property. He's starting to make the distinction from a very young age that he would call the slave-holding Christianity of the land, using Christianity to justify enslaving people, versus the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. And so fast forward, it's not just about history. This is not just about the past. The more that our young people know where they come from, they can better navigate the world in which they live in the present and in the future. And I've seen young people, when they hear that example, they'll say, well, why is it because I'm born into a certain zip code, I have less access and opportunity to education, economic opportunity, healthcare, and many other things, versus somebody that's born into another zip code through no fault of their own? And they realize, well, from the beginning, the playing field is not level. So how can we start to challenge those systems and policies to affect change down the road? It's not easy. Frederick Douglass said, without struggle, there is no progress. And anytime there has been perceived advancement of Black people in history, there's always been a backlash. After the Civil War, when the last of 4 million people that were enslaved were freed in 1865, and then we started to move in the Reconstruction years, in those 12 years, and there was failure after that, and then we went into Jim Crow, and then we went into racial terrorism and lynching and mass incarceration, human trafficking. So the work has never been easy, but our ancestors never gave up. They did so much with so little. How can we do something with a whole lot more than what they had?
Dr. Morris, this has been extremely rich. I'd like to continue the conversation if we could with one more round, because some things you've touched upon, I just want to lift up a bit more. You've talked about the importance of education. And today's actually a historic moment in the life of our nation. Dr. Cornel West, who is a scholar, taught at Harvard, Princeton, is now at Union Theological Seminary, has chosen Dr. Melina Abdullah of Black Lives Matter as his presidential running mate for the 2004 campaign. What's your initial reaction to that choice and the potential to have these two academicians leading our nation?
Well, I hadn't heard the news yet. I know that there was an announcement expected today, so that's the first I'm hearing of it. And I think that's an excellent choice. When you look at Dr. Cornel West and the work that he has done in academia, but also for civil rights, and just his voice, he speaks with a moral authority because he's about love, he's about compassion, he's also brilliant. And so I don't know a whole lot about his vice presidential running mate. but I can only imagine that he's picked somebody that carries forward the same, values and the same ethos that he carries forward. And I imagine that that's going to be a very powerful combination, that once people hear about the policies that he is thinking about and how he wants to put those forward, and gets around the country and starts meeting people and shaking hands. And one thing I can say about Dr. Cornel West, because I know him, is he's a very passionate man, and he wants the best for the country. He wants the best for humanity. And that's something that obviously we need. We need leaders that don't care about them, don't put themselves first ahead of country, or don't put their party ahead of their country. And certainly Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, many others understood that while they were born into a country that did not give them the rights, did not treat them as full human beings, enslaved them, they always believed that the country could do better. Frederick Douglass gave one of the greatest speeches in American history on July 5th, 1852 in Rochester, New York, called "What to the American Slave is the 4th of July." And there were 600 anti-slavery people in attendance, and these were his supporters, these were his people, but he railed into them. And while he started with the founding fathers and he said they were wise men, but he also said oppression makes a wise man mad, he talked about the founding ideals of this country and how in principle they are good, but we have not lived up to them. And then he just lays into his audience and he says, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" I answer, a day that reminds him or reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. They had invited him to celebrate Independence Day while his people were enslaved, while he was standing on the blood-drenched soil of America. But one thing that he did do at the end of the speech was he ended on a hopeful note. He said, "This country is only 76 years old, and we still have time to get this right." He always ended on a hopeful note. And Dr. Cornel West is somebody that I see as a hopeful person. Yes, he challenges the country to do better. He's always challenging the country to do better, but he also believes that we can do better. So I'm really excited about his choice and learning more about her.
Yeah, I was actually pleased to hear her acceptance of his choice and the way in which she spoke to the values of truth, justice, and love, and saw those as principles that have grown out of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think it's going to be a very powerful combination. I know that you're traveling very soon, leaving the country, and so we don't want to take up too much more of your time, but the ladies may still have a question each. Renee, should we let Dr. Pam go first since you had the first time round last time?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Dr. Pam? You're muted, Dr. Pam.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't have any more questions, but I really am contemplating the value of your entry to know where you came from. So I'm going to pay that forward because I know that because I understood the struggles of my grandparents and great grandparents. And at the end of every tale and all great detail, I knew that I needed an education to move forward. So I just thank you for your passion. I thank you for sharing the legacy of your bloodline. I thank you for lifting the message that I can now pay forward to my children and grandchildren. And I'm going to be watching what the overall effect of that might be as I move into my future and my children's future. So I just wanted to thank you very, very much. Know where you came from. I appreciate that.
Thank you for those very kind words of wisdom. And, I think all of us are perfect examples that we're never too old to keep learning. All of us went back to school to get our degrees later in life. And it's been my honor and pleasure to get to know all of you over all of these years now and to see the work, the incredible work that all of us are doing in our communities, which has been inspired by our education at the University of Laverne and the Ecumenical Center of Black Church Studies and our fearless educator, leader, Dr. Richard Rose, whom I met. And I got connected to the University of Laverne because I was very proud that the university gave me an honorary doctorate back in 2012. And as I traveled around the country talking to young people and talking about the importance of education, this light bulb went off in my head. Well, wait a minute, you you never finished school, so who are you to talk about getting an education? And so I was inspired to go back to school, and I started with one class, one semester, and one class the next semester. And then Dr. Rose sat me down. He said, if you go at this rate, it's going to take you 20 years to graduate. So I stepped it up a little bit and then was able to, as I said, when we started, get that degree, which I'm very, very proud of. So I thank all of you for inspiring me, for lifting me up at those times that I needed, because we all get frustrated in the work that we do. We get frustrated when we're studying and trying to learn and write papers. That's something that we need, kind of that communal support all around us. And so I thank you for those kind words.
Elder Renee, you have the last
My
question.
ways. So it doesn't matter where you come from in your religion. It just matters who you are and what spirit you live in.
Yeah, you know who you are and whose you are. That as well. And interfaith and that belief is really important, obviously, to all of our ancestors, but to my ancestors as well. And I know I've told a lot of stories here in the time that we've been together, but that's what I like to do. And when I think about interfaith and inner belief, I think about Frederick Douglass as a 15-year-old boy when he was self-educating himself in what his enslaver predicted happened. He became unfit to be enslaved. You couldn't tell him what to do. He was getting stronger. He was getting smarter. So he was sent to a slave breaker, and he would be hired out for 6 months, and that slave breaker would beat him almost every single day. He was actually hired out for a year, but the slave breaker beat him for 6 months straight. And then Frederick had finally had enough. And when he felt like he had been beaten down to the level of a brute or to an animal, there was that inner faith and that inner spirit inside of him that would not allow him to be broken, would not allow him to die. And he rose up and he fought back with his mind and with his physicality, not as a fist fight, because he understood that he needed to be strategic in the way he went about defeating his slave breaker, but they would have an epic 2-hour wrestling match, and Frederick Douglass would find, or Frederick Bailey, I should say, would finally win. And as he's huffing and puffing and standing over the slave breaker, he said to him, "You have seen how a boy has been made a slave, but now you see how a slave has been made a man." Frederick would go on to, I almost said graduate. He would go on to escape, but I guess it is a graduation in a sense. And he would become a licensed preacher in the AME church. And at the age of 22, Booker T. Washington, religion and faith was very important to his foundation of education at Tuskegee Institute, which he founded as the principal in 1881. And Booker T. Washington went to Wayland Seminary. So, foundational faith and spirituality and the Black church has been a part of the work, the civil rights work and educational work that my ancestors have done, just as many others have done. So it's that foundation of the Black church and Black faith that we, in my opinion, have gotten away from it in communities. And there are lots of reasons that we could talk about that we don't have time in this conversation. But the importance of the educational work that we are doing in the Ecumenical Center for Black Church Studies, and this 50th anniversary event that we're planning for October of this year, and the work that you all are doing with JOM, it's really important that interfaith and spirituality be embedded into our young people, so they're moving forward with that at the forefront of anything that they choose to do.
I think that's a wrap. We have had a wonderful 45-minute discussion with Dr. Morris, Dr. Pam, Elder Renee. Thank you so very much for your questions. Now, this was on Zoom, but we know each other. We've been in classrooms together, and so I think pressing the flesh with these young people will be delightful at some point in time. So again, thank you for this opportunity to introduce some history to our young people in the JOM program. And we look forward to actually meeting you in person, you and hopefully your family, and having a large celebration.
I look forward to that, and thank you again for inviting me to have this conversation. It's my honor. I'll end with a Booker T. Washington quote. He said, "If you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else." And so let's continue to lift each other up. And as soon as we have that first opportunity to press the flesh, as you said, and come together, I so look forward to that, and cannot wait to meet the young people in the program. So thank you very much.
Peace and blessings.
Peace and blessings. Thank you.
Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.